Sometimes the biggest mistake a person can make is assuming a uniform is the highest authority in the room. Officer Ryan Keller stood in the middle of the precinct parking lot with the easy confidence of a man who believed no one would ever question his judgment. The late afternoon sun reflected off patrol cars lined up in neat rows, while the American flag above the entrance drifted lazily in a warm Georgia breeze. Deputies moved in and out of the building carrying paperwork, chatting over coffee, and preparing for another ordinary shift. Nothing about the scene suggested that the next few minutes would be remembered for years to come. Then an unfamiliar black SUV rolled slowly toward the visitor spaces and came to a quiet stop. The driver stepped out without hurry. He wore a simple charcoal button-down shirt, dark jeans, polished brown boots, and a plain wristwatch that looked older than the vehicle itself. His posture carried an unmistakable discipline, the kind earned over decades rather than practiced in front of a mirror. His expression remained calm as he glanced toward the building before closing the driver's door with measured precision. Colonel Marcus Reed had spent more than 25 years serving his country, but today he carried no visible sign of rank, no decorated dress uniform, and no intention of introducing himself by title. To everyone watching, he appeared to be just another visitor with unfinished business. Keller noticed him immediately. Something about the stranger seemed to irritate him before a single word had been spoken. Perhaps it was the confidence. Perhaps it was the steady eye contact. Or perhaps it was simply the quiet certainty that refused to bend under suspicion. Whatever the reason, Keller walked across the parking lot with quick, deliberate steps until he blocked Marcus's path. Around them, conversations faded. A dispatcher looked through the front window. Two patrol officers paused beside their cruisers. Marcus stopped without showing the slightest sign of alarm. His hands remained visible at his sides, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was calm enough to soften the tension in the warm afternoon air. "Good afternoon, officer," Keller answered with a sharp stare instead of a greeting. "Where do you think you're going?" The question sounded less like curiosity and more like a challenge. Marcus calmly explained that he had official business inside the precinct. Keller's eyes narrowed. "Official business?" he repeated with a skeptical laugh. "I don't think so." A few people nearby exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that something ordinary had already become something else. Marcus never raised his voice. He simply met Keller's gaze with remarkable patience, as though he had seen moments like this before. "I'd appreciate the opportunity to explain," he said. Keller stepped closer, convinced that control belonged entirely to him. What he didn't notice was a retired veteran fueling his pickup across the street, suddenly freezing as he studied Marcus's face. He didn't notice another witness quietly lifting a phone to record, and he certainly didn't notice that hundreds of miles away, a secure line had just begun to ring, setting into motion events that would soon change everyone standing in that parking lot. 3 hours earlier, the morning had begun with nothing more dramatic than a long stretch of highway beneath a pale blue sky. Colonel Marcus Reed guided his black sport utility vehicle through rolling farmland as the first rays of sunlight warmed the windshield. He had driven nearly 180 miles from Fort Eisenhower after receiving a personal request that could not be handled through a phone call or an email. Years in the United States Army had taught him that some conversations deserved to happen face to face, especially when trust and accountability were involved. His service record filled multiple pages, decorated with commendations that reflected decades of leadership. Yet none of those accomplishments mattered to him as much as the quiet promise he had made to treat every person with dignity regardless of circumstance. As the miles passed beneath his tires, Marcus thought about the young soldiers he had mentored over the years. He had always reminded them that true authority was measured by restraint rather than intimidation. A leader earned respect through character long before rank appeared on a uniform. Those lessons had followed him from training grounds to overseas assignments and eventually into senior command, becoming the foundation of the officer he had chosen to become. When he reached the small Georgia town shortly before noon, he intentionally left his service jacket hanging inside the vehicle. He preferred simple clothes whenever official protocol did not require otherwise, because he believed people revealed their true character when titles and decorations disappeared. The courthouse stood across from a family diner where retirees gathered over coffee, and the police precinct sat only a short walk away. Everything about the town suggested routine, familiarity, and quiet confidence. Store owners greeted one another by name. Children rode bicycles along wide sidewalks, and church bells echoed gently across the square. Marcus stopped at the diner first, ordering a sandwich and unsweetened iced tea before reviewing a folder containing carefully organized documents. Nothing inside the folder carried classified information, but every page reflected weeks of preparation and coordination. An elderly man wearing a faded veteran's cap noticed Marcus carefully folding a small American flag that had slipped from the folder. The older gentleman smiled politely and thanked him for his service without asking any questions. Marcus returned the smile with genuine warmth, paid for his lunch, and continued toward the precinct on foot. Along the way, he paused to help a young mother retrieve a stroller wheel that had caught on the edge of a curb. She thanked him, unaware that the calm stranger beside her carried responsibilities extending far beyond the quiet streets surrounding them. Marcus simply wished her a pleasant afternoon before continuing toward the brick building ahead. Inside the precinct, however, a very different mood was beginning to take shape. Officer Ryan Keller had arrived frustrated after a difficult week filled with complaints, paperwork, and growing pressure from supervisors. Rather than leaving those frustrations behind, he carried them into every interaction, allowing assumptions to replace patience. As Marcus approached the entrance with steady confidence and an unhurried stride, two very different philosophies of leadership moved closer with every passing second, neither man fully aware that their meeting would soon draw attention far beyond the borders of that quiet town. Marcus Reed stopped just a few feet from the entrance and waited without impatience, his eyes briefly taking in the familiar rhythm of a small-town police department. Officers carried clipboards across the parking lot, a detective loaded boxes into an unmarked vehicle, and a crossing guard laughed with a school resource officer finishing lunch. It looked like any other afternoon in America, the kind where routine quietly convinced everyone that tomorrow would look exactly the same. Marcus appreciated places like this because they reminded him of the communities that thousands of service members had dedicated their lives to protecting. He believed deeply that law enforcement and the military shared the same responsibility to serve the public with honor, discipline, and restraint. That belief had never changed, even after decades of witnessing difficult moments that tested both institutions. He adjusted the folder beneath his arm and took one calm step toward the front door before Ryan Keller deliberately moved into his path again. The officer folded his arms and studied Marcus from head to toe with an expression that suggested he had already reached a conclusion. Instead of asking for identification or clarification, Keller let several long seconds pass in complete silence, almost inviting the people nearby to notice the encounter. Marcus remained perfectly still. His breathing never changed. His shoulders stayed relaxed. Years of military leadership had taught him that silence often revealed more than hurried words. A young patrol officer walking toward the entrance slowed almost imperceptibly before deciding not to interrupt. Across the street, the retired veteran who had recognized Marcus earlier continued watching from beside the gas pumps, his forehead creasing with concern. Something about the stranger's posture felt unmistakably familiar to him, although he could not yet explain why. Keller finally spoke, his voice carrying across the parking lot. He questioned Marcus's purpose for being there and implied that he did not belong inside the building. Marcus answered politely that he had official business requiring only a brief meeting. He offered no title, no credentials, and no appeal to authority. He simply requested the same courtesy he would have extended to anyone else. Rather than accepting the explanation, Keller's skepticism only seemed to deepen. He circled half a step, positioning himself between Marcus and the entrance as though the conversation itself had become a test of control. Marcus noticed the movement but did not react. He had spent enough years leading soldiers to understand that confidence never needed to compete with insecurity. Nearby conversations faded almost completely. The dispatcher standing inside the glass lobby looked outside with growing curiosity. A civilian employee carrying mail paused beside the reception desk. Even those who could not hear every word sensed that an uncomfortable tension had settled over the front entrance. Marcus spoke once more, his tone measured and respectful. He explained that mutual respect usually solved misunderstandings long before they became unnecessary conflicts. The words were simple, yet they carried the quiet weight of experience. Keller answered with another dismissive glance, convinced he remained in complete command of the situation. None of the people watching realized that elsewhere a secure notification had already reached military authorities, confirming that Colonel Marcus Reed had failed to arrive for a scheduled check-in at the expected time. No alarms sounded. No sirens echoed. Only a series of calm professional phone calls quietly began connecting offices separated by hundreds of miles, while outside the little brick precinct, the distance between assumption and reality grew smaller with every passing second. Ryan Keller glanced toward the small crowd that had quietly formed around the entrance, and the attention seemed to strengthen his confidence rather than soften it. He believed every pair of watching eyes confirmed that he was the one expected to control the situation. Marcus Reed noticed the growing audience, but showed no sign of discomfort. His focus remained on the conversation itself, not the spectators surrounding it. He had learned long ago that a calm voice could carry farther than an angry one. Keller asked for identification again, this time with an edge that suggested the answer had already been judged before it was given. Marcus slowly reached into his shirt pocket and removed a leather card holder. His movements were deliberate, careful, and completely transparent. Instead of handing it over immediately, he simply said, "I am happy to cooperate." Keller accepted the identification without thanks and looked at it for only a brief moment before closing the holder again. He barely examined the information inside, apparently convinced that the document could not possibly change his opinion. "Anyone can carry an impressive-looking card," he remarked loud enough for several people nearby to hear. A few uncomfortable glances passed between the younger officers standing only a few yards away. One of them seemed ready to speak, but stopped after noticing Keller's expression. Marcus answered with the same measured tone that had defined every word since arriving. "If you have any questions about the identification, I encourage you to verify it through the proper channels." The suggestion was simple, reasonable, and respectful. Keller dismissed it almost immediately. He took a half-step closer, convinced that confidence alone would settle the matter. "You expect me to believe this?" he asked. Marcus did not respond with frustration. Instead, he looked briefly toward the American flag above the building before returning his attention to Keller. "Belief is not necessary," he replied quietly. "Verification usually works better." Those words lingered in the warm afternoon air longer than anyone expected. Across the street, the retired veteran slowly removed his baseball cap, staring more carefully at Marcus's face. Recognition began to replace uncertainty. He remembered seeing that same officer speaking during a military appreciation ceremony nearly 2 years earlier. The realization caused him to reach for his own telephone, although he hesitated before dialing. Inside the precinct lobby, the dispatcher finally decided to notify the watch commander that an unusual situation was unfolding outside the entrance. The message was delivered calmly, without urgency, because no one yet imagined how significant the encounter would become. Miles away, another secure communication reached a regional military police command office. The response was immediate but disciplined, following established procedures rather than emotion. Names were confirmed. Locations were verified. Transportation was authorized. Back outside, Marcus folded his hands loosely in front of him and waited with remarkable patience. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet disappointment that such a routine visit had become unnecessarily complicated. Keller interpreted that silence as hesitation. He believed he was steadily winning an argument that Marcus had never intended to fight. Around them, conversations had almost completely stopped. Even the breeze seemed quieter as everyone sensed that the next few minutes would reveal far more than either man had expected. Marcus Reed made no effort to reclaim the identification holder resting in Ryan Keller's hand. Instead, he simply waited, giving the officer every opportunity to follow the process he had politely suggested from the beginning. Years of military leadership had taught Marcus that patience often revealed character more clearly than confrontation ever could. He had stood through difficult negotiations, commanded soldiers under enormous pressure, and represented the United States in meetings where every sentence carried lasting consequences. Compared to those moments, standing quietly in front of a small-town precinct required no extraordinary effort. Keller, however, interpreted the silence as uncertainty. He glanced around once more, aware that more people had drifted toward the entrance without appearing obvious about it. A delivery driver slowed his hand truck. Two administrative employees paused just inside the glass doors. Even passing motorists seemed to notice that something unusual was unfolding. Keller cleared his throat and spoke with increasing confidence, convinced that public certainty would discourage further questions. Marcus listened without interruption. When the officer finally paused, Marcus answered with the same calm voice that had never risen above ordinary conversation. "Every organization depends on procedures," he said. "When procedures are followed, misunderstandings usually disappear." The sentence was neither criticism nor challenge. It sounded more like advice from someone who had spent decades teaching younger leaders to remain disciplined under pressure. Keller offered a brief smile that carried more dismissal than humor. He returned the leather holder, but made no attempt to verify its contents through dispatch or any official database. Marcus accepted it with a courteous nod and carefully placed it back inside his shirt pocket. As he adjusted the folder beneath his arm, the cuff of his sleeve shifted just enough to reveal a simple military academy ring that had become worn from years of service. Across the street, the retired veteran noticed it immediately. His uncertainty vanished. He remembered shaking that same hand after a leadership seminar for Gold Star families several years earlier. Without drawing attention to himself, he quietly stepped away from the gas pumps and placed a respectful phone call to a former colleague who still worked within the military community. He did not exaggerate what he had seen. He simply described the location, the name, and the unusual circumstances. The response on the other end became noticeably more serious. Inside the precinct, the watch commander had now been informed twice that a disagreement continued outside, yet because voices remained controlled and no immediate danger appeared to exist, he chose to finish reviewing a report before walking to the lobby. Meanwhile, at a regional military installation, a transportation request received final approval. No emergency language was used. No dramatic orders were shouted. Professionalism guided every decision. A small team simply prepared to verify the welfare of a senior officer whose scheduled communication had unexpectedly stopped. Back outside, Marcus glanced briefly at his wristwatch before looking toward the entrance once again. His appointment time had already passed, but frustration never appeared on his face. He believed that dignity was easiest to maintain when it was tested rather than when it was convenient. Around him, the afternoon remained strangely quiet. The breeze lifted the flag overhead, birds crossed the bright summer sky, and every passing second carried the unseen weight of decisions that had already begun moving steadily toward the little brick precinct from far beyond the town's borders. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere remained deceptively ordinary. Telephones rang, keyboards clicked, and officers moved from one assignment to another, unaware that several quiet decisions made far beyond the town limits were steadily converging on their location. The watch commander finally stepped into the lobby after receiving another update from the dispatcher. Through the large glass windows, he could see Ryan Keller standing near the entrance with the same visitor who had arrived several minutes earlier. From a distance, nothing appeared urgent. There were no raised voices, no signs of panic, and no indication that the conversation had become anything more than an extended disagreement. Even so, something about the visitor's calm posture caught his attention. Outside, Marcus Reed remained exactly where he had been asked to wait. His patience never appeared forced. He occasionally glanced toward the entrance, then toward the quiet street beyond the parking lot, as though he trusted that time would eventually answer every unanswered question. Ryan Keller interpreted that composure as stubbornness. He continued speaking with complete confidence, convinced that every additional minute strengthened his position. Marcus listened respectfully before answering with another simple observation. Professional organizations become stronger when every decision can withstand careful review. The statement sounded less like a warning than a principle repeated throughout a lifetime of service. Keller responded with a dismissive shrug, certain there would be nothing to review. Across the street, the retired veteran lowered his telephone after finishing a brief conversation. His former colleague had recognized the name immediately. Within minutes, another call reached the office responsible for monitoring senior leadership travel. Schedules were checked. Contact logs were reviewed. The expected arrival time had already passed without confirmation. No one assumed the worst. Instead, Experienced professionals followed established procedures exactly as they had been trained to do. A transportation team acknowledged the assignment and departed without unnecessary urgency, understanding only that they needed to verify the well-being of a senior Army officer. Back at the precinct, a younger patrol officer quietly approached the watch commander and mentioned that the visitor had repeatedly encouraged verification instead of argument. That detail caused the commander to hesitate. He looked through the window again and noticed that Marcus had never attempted to leave, never argued, and never displayed anything other than courtesy. The commander instructed the dispatcher to perform a routine records inquiry using the information available. The request entered the system only moments before another incoming communication interrupted the process. The dispatcher answered, listened carefully, and her expression changed almost imperceptibly. She asked the caller to repeat the information, then wrote several notes before transferring the call to the watch commander. He accepted the receiver with a puzzled expression that gradually became one of careful attention. Outside, neither Marcus nor Keller could hear the conversation taking place inside the building. They only noticed subtle changes. Employees began moving with greater purpose. A detective who had been preparing to leave quietly returned inside. The retired veteran watched from across the street without saying a word, sensing that the truth was finally beginning to catch up with assumptions. Marcus adjusted the folder beneath his arm once more and looked toward the horizon as the faint sound of approaching vehicles drifted through the warm afternoon air, still too distant for anyone else to recognize, but steadily drawing closer. With every passing mile, the first indication that something had changed was not a siren, a shouted command, or a flashing emergency light. It was silence. Conversations around the precinct entrance gradually faded as several dark military vehicles turned onto the street with deliberate precision, traveling at a steady speed that reflected discipline rather than urgency. Every movement appeared coordinated, calm, and unmistakably professional. The retired veteran across the street straightened his posture the moment he recognized the markings. The watch commander stepped outside after ending the unexpected telephone call, his expression no longer carrying curiosity but careful concern. Ryan Keller turned toward the approaching convoy with visible confusion. He had expected the afternoon to continue exactly as it had begun. Instead, he watched the vehicles enter the parking lot one by one before stopping in an orderly formation. Their doors opened almost simultaneously, and uniformed military police officers stepped onto the pavement with measured confidence. There was no dramatic display, no unnecessary noise, and no attempt to intimidate anyone. They simply carried themselves with the quiet certainty that comes from extensive training and absolute clarity of purpose. The senior officer leading the team surveyed the area for only a brief moment before walking directly toward Marcus Reed. Everyone nearby instinctively moved aside, creating a clear path without being asked. Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing throughout the entire encounter. His expression did not change. He neither smiled nor celebrated. He simply waited. When the senior military police commander reached him, he came to a complete stop, raised a precise salute, and spoke in a calm, unmistakably respectful voice. "Good afternoon, Colonel Reed. We apologize for the unexpected delay, sir." The words settled over the parking lot with astonishing weight. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Ryan Keller looked from Marcus to the military police commander and back again, as though trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. The watch commander immediately recognized the significance of the greeting. His posture straightened instinctively as years of professional training reminded him that respect between institutions mattered just as much as authority itself. Marcus returned the salute with quiet professionalism before lowering his hand. "Thank you for coming," he replied. "I believe there has simply been a misunderstanding that deserves to be resolved through proper procedure." Even then, he refused to accuse anyone or raise his voice. The military police commander nodded once before turning toward the watch commander. He introduced himself courteously, presented official credentials, and explained that Colonel Reed had been expected at a scheduled coordination meeting. When routine communication had unexpectedly stopped, established accountability procedures required verification of his welfare. Every sentence remained factual, measured, and completely professional. The watch commander accepted the credentials with visible respect and immediately invited the military police team inside to review the situation. Around the parking lot, officers who had quietly observed the encounter exchanged uncertain glances, realizing that the calm visitor they had barely noticed was in fact a senior leader entrusted with tremendous responsibility. Ryan Keller remained motionless, still processing the simple truth that the man he had repeatedly underestimated had never once relied on rank to demand respect. Instead, he had relied on patience, dignity, and confidence that the truth would eventually arrive on its own. And now that truth had stepped through the front gate wearing the unmistakable uniform of the United States Army. The conference room inside the precinct became remarkably quiet as representatives from both agencies gathered around a long wooden table. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations, and no hurried conclusions. Instead, every person present understood that the next steps would be guided by facts rather than assumptions. The military police commander thanked the watch commander for his cooperation before requesting that all available records connected to the encounter be preserved according to standard procedure. The request was met without hesitation. The watch commander immediately instructed staff to secure dispatch logs, security camera recordings, radio traffic, and any available body-worn camera footage so that the sequence of events could be reviewed accurately and completely. Marcus Reed accepted a seat only after everyone else had done so, demonstrating the same quiet professionalism that had defined his actions throughout the afternoon. He spoke calmly, explaining that he had arrived for a scheduled coordination meeting, identified himself when requested, and repeatedly encouraged verification through official channels. He emphasized that his concern was not personal embarrassment, but the importance of maintaining public confidence in institutions that existed to serve every citizen fairly. His words carried no anger, only a sincere belief that accountability strengthened honorable organizations rather than weakened them. The watch commander listened carefully, occasionally making notes before asking thoughtful questions designed to establish a complete timeline. As each answer was documented, the available evidence consistently aligned with Marcus's account. The dispatcher confirmed the times of the incoming communications. Administrative staff described what they had observed from inside the lobby. The retired veteran who had witnessed much of the interaction voluntarily provided a respectful statement, explaining that he had recognized Colonel Reed only after noticing his academy ring and recalling a leadership event several years earlier. Even the younger patrol officer acknowledged that Marcus had repeatedly requested proper verification instead of confrontation. Every additional statement added another piece to the same picture. Ryan Keller sat quietly as the review continued. The confidence that had filled the parking lot earlier had been replaced by thoughtful reflection. For the first time that afternoon, he listened without interrupting. When the body-worn camera recording began playing, the room remained silent. The footage showed Marcus maintaining a respectful tone, keeping his hands visible, answering questions directly, and encouraging established procedures at every opportunity. No one needed to interpret the recording because it spoke clearly on its own. The watch commander paused the review and looked around the room before expressing appreciation that the situation had remained calm enough for objective evidence to exist. He explained that preserving public trust required honesty whenever mistakes or misunderstandings occurred. The military police commander agreed, noting that discipline meant accepting responsibility as readily as accepting authority. Marcus simply nodded. He had heard those principles repeated throughout his entire career, and he believed they applied equally to every uniform. Outside, the afternoon sun slowly began settling toward the horizon as ordinary life continued around the quiet town. Inside the precinct, however, something far more important than a single misunderstanding had taken place. People from different institutions had chosen facts over assumptions, professionalism over pride, and accountability over appearances, proving that the strongest foundation of justice was never found in rank alone, but in the willingness to let the truth speak for itself. As the meeting concluded, the watch commander stood and thanked everyone for approaching the situation with professionalism instead of emotion. He acknowledged that public trust depended not on claiming perfection, but on demonstrating integrity whenever questions arose. The preservation of evidence, the willingness to review every detail, and the cooperation between agencies had transformed what began as an uncomfortable misunderstanding into an opportunity to strengthen the standards both organizations promised to uphold. Colonel Marcus Reed gathered his folder without displaying satisfaction or resentment. His purpose had never been to embarrass anyone or prove that his rank placed him above another public servant. Before leaving the conference room, he looked around at the officers present and spoke with the calm confidence that had guided him through every stage of his military career. "Every badge and every uniform represents a promise," he said. "The public cannot always see our titles, but they always remember how we make them feel. Respect should never depend on who someone turns out to be. It should begin the moment we meet them." The room remained silent as those words settled into the minds of everyone listening. Ryan Keller slowly stood from his chair. The certainty that had filled his voice earlier that afternoon had disappeared, replaced by honest reflection. He acknowledged that he should have relied on verification instead of assumptions and recognized that patience would have served both the department and the community far better than quick judgment. No one celebrated his discomfort, and no one attempted to humiliate him. Accountability had already accomplished what pride never could. The watch commander explained that departmental procedures would continue according to established policy, emphasizing that every review existed to improve professional standards and preserve the confidence of the people they served. The military police commander expressed appreciation for the cooperation shown once communication had been established, noting that mutual respect between institutions remained essential to protecting the communities they had all sworn to serve. As the afternoon faded into evening, the military police vehicles quietly departed the precinct one by one. There were no cheering crowds, no dramatic speeches, and no victory parade. Ordinary life returned to the small Georgia town almost as quickly as it had paused. The retired veteran across the street watched the convoy disappear before placing his cap back on his head with a quiet smile, reassured that dignity had spoken louder than confrontation. Marcus walked back toward his sport utility vehicle beneath a sky painted with soft shades of gold and orange. He paused briefly to look at the American flag above the precinct, offering a respectful nod before opening the driver's door. He still believed in the values that had guided him for more than 2 decades of service. He believed that honorable officers existed in every profession, that accountability protected good people rather than threatened them, and that leadership was measured most clearly during moments of misunderstanding. As he drove away, the brick precinct gradually disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the lesson remained behind. Assumptions may speak first, authority may appear convincing, and prejudice may seem powerful for a moment, yet none of them can stand for long when truth is allowed to arrive through patience, professionalism, and integrity. Because real justice does not announce itself with the loudest voice. It quietly reveals itself when character refuses to change, even after everything else does.